Welcome back to the Agents Angle, where it seems in the eyes of some, agents are increasingly to blame for many of the ills blighting the football world. I'm Jonathan Booker.
And I'm Peter Paleologus. Featured in this episode, there is a cautionary tale of attempted fraud involving one of the world's biggest clubs, as well as one of the most well-known names from the agency world. And of course, the hot topic currently, Diarra, which seems to have prompted FIFA to invite many others to open global dialogue.
Plus, we will also be looking at non-poaching clauses between clubs, and also how some officials seem to view agents as largely to blame for the Club World Cup and the need for yet more games.
All that to come on this episode of The Agents Angle.
So the world of football keeps turning even in the absence of a lot of club football in recent weeks, and also many transfer windows being closed. Yet one astounding thing this week is that we don't have anything new that is football related to announce from the ECJ, where FIFA seem to have taken up residence in recent months. Although by the time this episode of the show goes live, that may have changed.
Yes, a lot has happened since the Diarra ruling, the European Court of Justice ruling in the Diarra case. We covered that a couple of episodes ago, very detailed, and I've seen this topic is still going on LinkedIn, Jonathan. It's going, especially sports lawyers at conferences, so it's really not finished. Also, we know that the case is going back to the Belgian court, and we also need the final reasoning from the ECJ, so there's still a lot of clarity to come, but besides all the analysis from a lot of good sports lawyers of the case, I think for agents, and we're at the agent's angle, the agent's perspective, they need to know that the court, from the decision that we've unpacked, if I can call it that, stresses the importance in this decision of clubs being able to compete by recruiting trained players in professional football sector. And that any regulations that are imposed and provide a general restriction on this type of competition, where players as workers are free to seek further employment, then it's pretty similar to like a no-poaching agreement. And we know that the European Union and the European Court of Justice don't have much time for no-poach agreements, and we'll talk about a bit that later.
Yeah, it's definitely a big story, but one story that will definitely grab people's attention that we're going to start with today, and one that should ring alarm bells for not just agents, but also clubs, no matter how big they are. And the topic of tackling fraud and corruption is definitely more your area of expertise than mine, Peter. So I'll pass this one over to you.
Yes, we saw an article entitled FC Barcelona almost scores own goal in Lewandowski transfer scam. Basically, to break it down, there was some sort of apparent fraudster who impersonated a famous football agent and asked FC Barcelona, who we know have got financial issues the way they're dealing squad by squad every year, for €1 million. And the club attempted to send the money to that agent. However, the payment was blocked. I should say fake agent who was impersonating a famous agent. And a lot of experts are speculating that this is a worrying sign that football remains vulnerable to corruption, even though there's an attempt for stronger oversight. And look, this happens generally a lot. A lot of businesses have been scammed. Mums and dad families, there's a lot of scamming going on in a lot of countries. And we know there's also been cyber attacks. In relation to this article, the sources say that after receiving an email from, I think in relation to a large bank transfer, the email was from influencer agent Pinas or Penny Zahavi, who asked money to be sent to a Cypriot bank account in the name of a person from the Netherlands. That Dutch account holder did not have an account in Cyprus and claimed his identity had been stolen. Then the bankers in Cyprus blocked the payment and sought to see if that was a fraudulent account. Barcelona acknowledged that payment. It was an attempted fraud, but they did not make complaint to police. That's very interesting because I would have thought something like this, a scam at a very high level, you would pursue that. Now, in terms of the agent space, you really need to have a lot of protection. Besides having a really solid, reliable bank or international money transfer platform operator that you use, I think everyone, not just agents, but generally in the football business, have to be on high alert. Because there is false billing, there's, as I mentioned, scams, and all that can really cause very difficulties for people and financial losses. Now, the final point I want to make here is that club owners, just like Barcelona, and agents should always be on the lookout for common scams, in particular payment redirection scams or fake invoices. I've heard of phishing, business impersonation. We had impersonation here in this case involving Barcelona and the fake agent, and really need to be on top of this so they don't compromise security in the operations of their business. Agents have to also be on top of this when they're transferring money, because we know, Jonathan, international transfer money is very much part of the agents or agency business.
Yeah, and quite rightly, this story calls for better oversight on such matters in football. But much like yourself, what really surprised me is that the club didn't make a complaint to the police. And I'm sure many may be asking, why not? And to an extent, that sort of sums up football in some ways. A lot of complacency, neglect, and a lack of care, and also due diligence. But this is one of the biggest names in football agency. And if someone at a giant club like Barcelona can't verify him, either by picking up the phone and calling him direct or via the player, how much fraud could be achieved with regards to agents, clubs, and players lower down football's pecking order? And people passing themselves off as licensed agents is nothing new. It used to happen a lot. And I know several agents who've had people claim to be them in the agent's world. And to rub salt in the wound, we have no official FIFA directory to verify licensed agent credentials, but we do have these FIFA digital IDs for agents, which I'm sure someone could mock one up for Mr. Zahavi or any other agent in a matter of 30 minutes to an hour quite easily.
Yes, there are a lot of risks in operating in international business. And as you say, a lot of scams out there, people impersonating. But one interesting thing, and I have to say it's part of the FFAR, the FIFA Football Agent Regulations, or was supposed to be part of it, is the FIFA Clearinghouse. We know that that was supposed to deal with a lot of these issues, Jonathan. That was going to be a platform where club fees, of course, agent fees were going to go through and be paired up. So clubs who made payments or players or and agents who were involved in the deal and claiming amounts would go through that to avoid this sort of concern about scams, payments requested that shouldn't be there, etc. And obviously to deal with the fake agents issue as well, because the clearinghouse would have been linked into the licensing system. So you can double check accounts and all that. But it goes back to who you're working with and really, do you know the person? And obviously, do you have a relationship with them? That's why maybe there's also a trend where we see a lot of clubs or club directors only operate with agents they know or who've got a track record, because there is a lot of misrepresentation in the markets. There's trust issues. And until you build up those relationships and then get into the deal side where you get your financial benefits, you probably need to know the club and the directors and who you're dealing with to get that trust, because a lot of this happens. So that may be also part of what's happening out in the football agency world, also the club land as well, Jonathan. Now, there's another hot topic that's come out of Diarra, seems we're going back to Diarra, and this is FIFA's response to the Diarra outcome or the Diarra decision. Been quite a few articles, and I won't name them all, but FIFA has made some announcements and they're open to dialogue in relation to the article that was affected, mainly Article 17 of the Regulations of Status of Transfer Players after the Diarra decision. Now, we, Jonathan, attended a recent Law in Sport webinar on Friday, the 18th of October, which was very informative. It brought a lot of different, I would say, only sport lawyers and some academics, and they were all offering their opinion on what Diarra meant. A lot of them, I would say, it wasn't a Bosman, but it was groundbreaking in many ways, especially for the employment of players. Now, it depends what law you listen to. Everyone's got a bit of an angle on it, but it really had to have a FIFA response. And what was FIFA's response? FIFA put a message out there saying that the transfer system is not broken, but it is always in transition. So it's not broken, but always in transition. So there are going to be changes. That was sort of their approach to the football regulatory framework, has to remain in step with all stakeholder interests, in this case, clubs, but more importantly, players. I'll just summarise what FIFA really wants to do going forward, and it's pretty much open dialogue. They want open discussions with stakeholders on Article 17, as I mentioned before, following the European Court of Justice ruling in the Diarra case. As we said previously, the ECJ, European Court of Justice, found that FIFA's rule restricting players from terminating contracts and seeking employment elsewhere violate European Union laws on free movement and competition. Now, FIFA also stressed that the Diarra decision only impacts 2 paragraphs of its regulation, and the rest of the transfer system remains intact. And I'll just quote from Emilio Garcia Silvero, FIFA's chief legal officer. He acknowledged this ruling, requiring that we need to revisit parts of FIFA's agreements with the European Commission. But this decision does not abolish the existing transfer system. Now, there's a difference between the transfer system and the transfer market. I might touch on that a bit later, Jonathan. But a lot of these views were discussed at Law in Sport of what the impact was. Now, FIFA's moved into the engagement phase.
Just going back to that webinar by Law in Sport, there was a quote which for me was absolute pure gold when referring to the rules governing the transfer system, and it was organised contractual instability. Organised instability, and I may even get a t-shirt with that on for someone. But the response from FIFA just seems to be a lot of shrugging of shoulders yet again, if not doubling down. And it again begs the question whether a serious attitude adjustment is needed on such serious matters. And for me, having looked at the video, which is more of a statement, and reading the written releases from FIFA, it wasn't an independent interview and more prepared, and that is again disappointing. And if people watch the video with FIFA's chief legal and compliance officer, the body language is quite interesting as well. But this notion of FIFA being open to global dialogue or consultation is pretty hard to swallow when you consider the FFAR debacle. I won't be partaking. Frankly, I have better things to do than probably being ignored. But the invitation is there for people to be part of a consultation process. And I use the term consultation quite loosely. And I know many will want to contribute to that and give their ideas and share their opinions. But all I would say to people is, one, you don't have long to do this. I think it's about a month. I think it's the 15th of November is the deadline. And two, you can submit your comments via email or via an online form on FIFA's website. All I would do is actually post your constructive and professional comments somewhere else as well, maybe for people to comment and consider themselves, so that all can see and consider what you propose, what you think of this, and it's not filtered at the other end. The interesting thing is, we know FIFA don't view agents as official stakeholders, but this invitation is slightly different. And FIFA have phrased it that it's an invitation to all relevant and affected parties. So with transfer-related matters, that involves agents, because agents are clearly both relevant and affected by this matter. Yet, what will happen if FIFA don't listen to what people say in such a dialogue? Will there be strikes by players? Clubs going to non-FIFA structures and competitions? Because we can't keep going back to court on these matters. It takes time and people's careers and livelihoods are on the line. If FIFA aren't careful, there will be a straw that breaks the camel's back. And it's safe to say that FIFA already have a huge bale of straw to deal with.
Yeah, you make a good point there, Jonathan. FIFA has got a lot on its plate. Diarra, the FIFA football agent regulation case, which features caps and a few other elements, and also the FIFA-driven case relating to the calendar and the players, how many games they play. So a lot of cases can change the landscape, and FIFA has got a lot on its plate. Going back to the Diarra decision, it does still leave FIFA as the regulator. That's intact. There has to be someone. It does not take the power away from FIFA in regulating the transfer system. There is a difference, though, between the transfer system and the transfer market. Agents need to understand this. The system is obviously the rules, but there is also the transfer market, the demand for players, clubs, and there's so many things that agents work outside the system that are not going to be affected by this decision. Obviously, clauses, whether it's a sell-on clause between one club and another, club bonuses for players, other type of contract triggers and incentives. We're seeing more unique clauses in contracts for players. Loans, which is part of the system, but the way it works, especially if you've also got the multi-club ownership, which is quite prevalent these days. And also the fact that transfers are down a little bit. We've seen a lot of the leagues, especially in terms of big transfers, been reducing. So there's got to be other ways that agents are working to be able to push players and obviously be able to make money as well, because they are operating businesses. The other thing with Diarra, How does the Diarra ruling have an effect outside FIFA? That's still uncertain because FIFA can update the regulations and the members can adjust their own rules. But what happens about non-EU contracts in the EU? That remains unclear based on this decision. It's not clear what will happen, that you can have a new framework that's European Union consistent, but FIFA governs all the associations, all the confederations. And we've got to look at this globally as well, not just solely at the RA decision how to make changes, but the engagement has to be on a worldwide level. Until the decision's made or changes to regulations, I just want to leave on this point, Jonathan. What's going to happen with wrongful terminations in the meantime? We're in a grey area. No one's really discussed that. Agents need to know about that because they represent players. What happens in the current state of affairs since Diarra?
I can make one accurate prediction, Peter. Whatever happens, it's good news for the lawyers. But thanks to Law in Sport once again, Sean and the team, the checks in the post, for putting together that webinar on Diarra and discussing what happens post-Diarra. But Law in Sport also released a very interesting article in recent weeks by Emmanuel Goriola, in a way linked to Diarra elements on the matter of player contracts. Now, the title on first glance may be a little misleading in a way, but poaching is a plague, whether it be by clubs or by agents. But it is almost an accepted element of the business, rightly or wrongly. There are rules and regulations that supposedly outlaw such practices as poaching and tapping up of players, and there's even memorandums of understanding between clubs. But we know they are broken as general practice. This Portuguese example in this article, for me, isn't poaching as many would recognise it, but more so a collusion to restrict people's rights, namely players. In fact, there is sort of a link here to the Diarra case and the whole topic of just cause.
No poach clauses, in a contract where you maybe prohibit former employees from poaching other employees when they set up a business, or taking clients and customers away after they've resigned and their employment's been terminated. But this article, because poaching can mean a lot of things, it can cover a lot of ground, and we'll talk a little bit about how it also affects agents. But you mentioned the Portuguese. What that was about in this article was in 2020, I believe, 31 Portuguese football clubs agreed to prevent clubs from signing players who terminated their contracts due to the COVID-19 pandemic salary cuts. So there was 31 clubs from Portugal getting together, and they would basically say, you're prevented if you leave from these 31 clubs, you couldn't sign within that sort of grouping. And these sort of no-poach agreements raise, and not just Europe, in America and Australia, a lot of countries that got antitrust laws, competition laws, they limit player mobility and affect the labour market. And that's why they also mention Diarra, because Diarra sort of has elements of non-poaching or poaching where a player just can't move on unilaterally. So I think that's why there's an interrelationship there. This article also discussed some insights into the European Commission's non-binding policy on non-poach agreements and used examples of similar sports: European Super League, Major League Baseball, NFL, Mexican and European football, where different examples used whether poaching's lawful or not. The key thing, and this is for agents also to consider when you're coming up in contracts, club contracts which have an anti-poach or poaching clause in the player agreement, how you can scrutinise that. How does it affect the player's rights going forward? Are they free to work if they leave? Are they free to move? Mobility. That needs to be scrutinised. And that's an agent's role, maybe with the lawyer, to see what a contract restricts a player from, whether they're being poached or whether they can move on. Now, we know that the Diarra case, the court found that you can't reduce players' bargaining power or limit their employment opportunities, because that could affect their remuneration expectations or remuneration going forward. So you've got to look at the agreement. And we all know that any anti-competitive agreements are not seen well by courts. They will strike them down. And we know the Diarra case, the outcome, we've discussed that as well. But if we move on a little bit with poaching, it can arise in other different instances. I know in America, there was a case, a good NBA agent, where there was a poaching lawsuit against another agency. So one agent went up against another agent for poaching a player. That case was dismissed, but we know it's very strong in America, and this applies in the agency. And also we know, and we've covered this in a previous podcast, Jonathan, the Brazilian decision on the FFAR, where they struck down part of it, the Brazilian court, saying that exam was in Portuguese, unfair for Brazilian agents And then they also looked at the representative contract, because the FIFA or FFAR and the Brazilian national football regulations that came out of the FFAR had a different prohibition in relation to poaching, where it prohibits approaching or concluding a representative contract with a player who's under exclusive contract with another agent. So we know that even in the FFAR, if someone's under an exclusive agreement, another agent can't approach that player until the last 2 months. However, the Brazilians had a system where they had also joint and several liabilities. So if someone made an approach, club, another agent, whatever it was, mainly another agent, they could be liable. And the Brazilian court looked at that as well and saying there's inconsistency between the FIFA football age regulations and what Brazil law says. We know that poaching is a big issue. It's not just an issue club to club. It's an issue agent to agent. It's an issue pretty much anything to do with employment and moving on to new opportunities, Jonathan.
And that article is fascinating on so many levels, not least because it covers different cases as well. It's not just one case. And cases from around the world, there's an interesting one there from Mexico, and there's also other sports. But we've mentioned how US sports are very different, if not a bit ahead of football globally in some ways, such as those CBA's collective bargaining agreements. But many of those came about from restrictive, if not exploitative, practices by club owners and franchisees historically, and often then striking by players, or walkouts as they're termed, a league effectively grinds to a halt. However, this case is a little bit different from those others mentioned in the article because, as you said rightly, the aspect of the pandemic. As such, for me, there's two sides to this story, and I can understand the predicament of the clubs here to an extent. As I said, it was a pandemic, and therefore, what were the force majeure provisions nationally and also globally within FIFA's regulations? The clubs were losing money, as were any other businesses at the time, which impacts on employees, in this case, players. In the UK, we had the furlough scheme, which arguably made life simpler for all businesses. And in football, it helped players and clubs, arguably more so at the lower levels of the game. And many agents worked very hard at that time around the world, working with various parties to negotiate agreements such as mutual terminations, extensions, deferring payments. I'm not sure if any of those were mediated. But I don't know what provisions were available to people in Portugal during the pandemic. Maybe it's one for us to reach out to people and try and find that out. Whether the Players' Union got involved or whether they had a similar government subsidised furlough scheme. But away from that, if any group of employees, whether footballers or whatever, were effectively stopped from working elsewhere and being employed by another club, it is akin to almost a cartel type agreement, and that's wrong. But as I said, I can understand the club's predicament in this case, although they do seem to have handled it in a really reckless way. And as with most things we speak of, this leads us back to FFAR in a way, with the restrictions and the lack of protection for agents. Not least the question marks over imposing a cap on what someone can earn without their consent or the way in which they work, which is similar in some ways to this dispute over so-called poaching agreements.
They say Diarra's going to change the landscape in one way, and that's, you mentioned, we don't know what happened in Portugal, but in a lot of other countries, the player union did get involved. There were collective bargaining agreements where player would have to take, especially during the COVID pandemic, they would have to take pay cuts because obviously there was less money, no fans, pay TV rights were down, all that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, that was an exception. But going forward, in terms of football, we know the Diarra case has pretty much got this, but also we know it's happened in the United States as well, that competition authorities and courts will attack restrictions on competition in the labour market, the employment market, which includes players, and in particular, non-poach agreements or practices. But this is also, agents are becoming, and clubs are becoming a little bit inventive. We know that release clauses are starting to be used, and some of those can also have a non-poach or release type flavour, and they can be tailored to very specific situations. I recall Robert Firmino's 2016 contract with Liverpool. There was an exception in that contract as he was allowed to be released to any club except Arsenal. which at the time was a significant rival or competitor with Liverpool, and he couldn't go there. And we're seeing that in some other contracts where you can't go to competitor clubs or they can't come in and poach you, whatever it is. So in the football space, especially for agents, they have to be aware of this. And also what I mentioned before, we know that the FIFA football agents regulations have got the non-poaching provision, especially for an exclusive agent, which you can't be in Germany. But I'm really interested to see when the agents chamber does get up and finally hear some cases, especially cases when one agent comes in to take a poach player from another agent, how they're going to interpret the regulation, how they're going to interpret poaching in the agent space. What is it? What makes it out? What's the conduct? What's the behavior? And Diarra has dealt with it in the labour employment market, but I'm really keen to see how not just FIFA or the Agents Chamber, but even national associations, how they deal with poaching issues that come between agents. So for agents, it's that aspect, losing players or players being poached by other agencies, but also agents need to be aware of the contracts going forward. Are there any anti-poaching provisions in there that restrict their players' movement? And in particular, I gave the Firmino example, but I know there's more examples of clubs saying, yeah, you can transfer, this is the fee, but you can't go to these clubs. You can't be poached there. So a lot of dynamics at play, and the agent space is certainly affected. Now, I want to move on to something else that caught my eye, and that is the famous player, ex-player, I should say, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge. He has mentioned something about agents, connecting that with the heavy schedule of players and why that's happened. And I'm going to read a quote to start it off. We'll put a couple of the articles on our show notes. The original interview was by the German football newspaper, if I can call it that, Kicker. And I'll read the quote first. The players and their agents have maneuvered themselves into this trap. By demanding more and higher salaries, they are forcing the clubs to generate even ever higher revenues. And how does this revenue come from? Through more games. We need to sit down with all those involved and discuss without emotion what mechanisms we need to bring back more serious and rational times, including the business aspect, he stressed. So just to break that down, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, former Bayern Munich chairman, former famous German striker, he agrees. There's too many games at the top level, and we know the FIFA is taking a case on that, if not some other stakeholders, but blames players and now listen to this, Jonathan, agents for increasing the game schedules. He states that players and agents who are demanding higher salaries are forcing clubs or pushing clubs to generate more revenue through additional matches. He suggests that parties should come together, discuss the issue of rationally and find a solution. Although Rummenigge does support the controversial Club World Cup and the reforms to the Champions League, which use the Swiss League type model, which also has increased the number of games. We know that since the Rodri injury, many players have voiced concern about too many games, and this is why this issue came to the fore. Too much pressure in professional football, playing too many matches. Interestingly, the article also mentions Joshua Kimmich. He enjoys playing more games, so there are players who do that. There's also a mention of English players playing about a congested schedule, despite having tournaments like the League Cup and all that. So what Rummenigge, and to close on this point, he says we need more sensible practices in football to address these issues. But with agents pushing higher salaries, the outcome is more games, clubs to generate more revenue. Jonathan.
I wonder what agents will get blamed for next. There's so many people in football sat in their ivory towers or echo chambers with their blinkers on, with not a thought for another person's perspective or position. Firstly, the nonsense of agents forcing clubs. I have never seen an agent frog march a club official to a cash point to make a payment. The word they should be looking for is no, or in this case, 9. Just because a higher salary is demanded by a player or an agent, the club doesn't, under any normal circumstances, have to say yes and pay it. But I have heard responsible club officials and owners say no to such demands. Point 2, this is Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, the first chairman of ECHA, the European Clubs Association, and now honorary chairman of ECHA, right? And ECHA even introduced the Karl-Heinz Rummenigge Award for Club Excellence in recent weeks, if I'm not mistaken. So who benefits most from the Club World Cup? Definitely FIFA, and arguably, after that, the clubs involved, many of whom are ECHA members. And on the point of sitting down to discuss matters, we understand from our sources that ECHA is one of the organisations who are reluctant to sit down at the same time as agents with FIFA on the matter of FFAR. You can't have it both ways. You can't demand to sit down and discuss things one minute and then choose not to the next. So in this case, just an off-the-cuff example, let's say agents start negotiating clauses in contracts on behalf of their client, the player, that precludes them from playing in certain competitions, such as the Club World Cup, in return for not requesting a higher salary. Would he be happy with that? Now, I think I'll leave this topic there. I haven't combusted so far yet this season, and I don't want to do so today.
I think that's a fair point, and I'll be very actually interested in what listeners think of the Rummenigge comments and how they see whether agents are partly to blame, why there's more games. There's a correlation there, which I don't agree with. But I will say this, agents have a crucial role, so much as FIFA in protecting players, and including in overuse in games. So really, it's something that needs to be addressed. But yeah, I'll be interested to see what listeners think of the Rummenigge comments and whether agents are partly to blame. Now, before we farewell, a few announcements. First of all, a big month in November for new potential agents who are taking the exam. But it was a conference that was on last week. It was the International Sports Law Association conference in Lisbon, Portugal. And I saw some feedback. I had a panel on the FIFA football agent regulations. And what sort of came out of that panel, one of the observations was that the FFAR, the FIFA football agents regulations, in trying to address imbalances which favoured super agents, may have created new ones. A couple of panelists were discussing that the asymmetric service of the fee cap, for instance, could push agents to deal more with the selling club side rather than representing players. We've heard this before. That was sort of raised in this international conference in Lisbon. So interesting that...
To be fair, Peter, we've both been saying that for years, as have many other people. So it's hardly rocket science. We saw it coming, that imbalance in the fee capping structure.
Yes, that's true. And I don't think anything innovative was discussed there, but it seems that there's always another impact. If you do something else may be created. And that was sort of the observations at that conference, which did hold a panel. And there's a lot of conferences still holding panels. And I won't mention yours, Jonathan, but I will say that SoccerX in Miami is in November 2024. We know Miami's got the agents department, so got Messi, so it is probably the center of the universe for agent influence at the moment, and it will be during the SoccerX Miami 2024. And the World Football Summit in my side of the world in Asia on the 2nd and 3rd of December in Saudi Arabia 2024. So that's the World Football Summit Asia. And that's it from me. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. We've got some exciting guests coming up, and bye from me.
Yeah, as Peter said, let us know your comments on that commentary about agents forcing more clubs and more fixtures. Your comments are always welcome, as are your reviews and your questions and your suggestions for guests. As Peter alluded to, in the meantime, I'm off to Norway later this week to deliver a presentation entitled A Critical View on FFAR, with FIFA representatives in the room, which should be interesting. And it's safe to say it has taken me longer to cut down the presentation than actually write it. So if you are attending the Nordic Sports Law Conference in Oslo this coming week, please do say hello. And for everyone else, until the next episode of The Agent's Angle, ta var og ha det nå.
The purpose of the Agent's Angle podcast is to provide news, information and facilitate discussion on regulatory matters, policies, business trends and issues affecting football agents worldwide. The opinions and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only and should never be considered legal or professional advice. Furthermore, the views expressed by guests are their own and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Thank you for listening.